Hi, I'm Menaka Raman-Wilms, and you're listening to The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. By now, you've probably heard a lot about the Ottawa protests. They're still going on, and now there's also truck blockades at two border crossings between the US and Canada, including the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor, Ontario, the busiest crossing in North America. Over the past 2 weeks, we've looked at the political reaction to the protests and how the ongoing occupation of downtown Ottawa has affected residents. But now, we want to focus on the people behind the protest movement. Who started it, and who's in charge? Today, Globe reporter Colin Freeze will help us understand who's leading the protests. This is The Decibel. Colin, thanks for speaking with us today.
I'm quite happy to be here.
So we've seen trucks and protesters occupy downtown Ottawa for like a week and a half now, after convoys traveled from different parts of the country to get to the capital. Who started organizing all of this?
Yeah, I think one of the key questions and key points of debates around this protest has always been are the truckers in the driver's seat or are they along for the ride? And certainly a look around the downtown streets of Ottawa would tell you there's a lot of rigs, drivers of rigs that are involved in this protest, tractor, transport trailers. That's not in fundamental dispute. I think, though, when you look in the organizing ranks, the sort of upper echelon, while there's truckers represented, there's also a lot of figures from the populist right who are not career truckers and who have been involved in a number of causes, unrelated to the trucking industry.
So do we have, I guess, a key figure? Like, who's really the person who kind of started all of this?
It is a broad assortment of people from a variety of causes that have converged here. But the three people whose names you keep seeing over and over are Tamera Leach, Benjamin Dichter, and Chris Barber. They are the people who generally, who put their names to the leadership of the convoy memos.
And how did all of this start? Do we have a sense of where things really began?
Well, I think you really have to rewind the tape to almost a time before the pandemic. There's a few ideological precursors to this current convoy protest. I think the one that's cited quite a bit is the 2019 United We Roll Yellow Vester sort of protest, which saw much smaller numbers of trucks come from Alberta, I think, go to Ottawa, have a protest, and then leave.
Can you remind us what the United We Roll was about?
Yeah. United We Roll was kind of, one part's Western alienation, one part sort of oil and gas and pipeline issues, one part people, being concerned about illegal immigration, and one part people who really didn't like the Liberal government and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. That was all sort of mixed in. But, so what's happened over the next 2 years? What happens over the next 2 years? The pandemic happens. And the governments of all governments, federal and provincial, gravitate towards powers that are by any measure heightened and greatly heightened. We see federal governments sort of closing off border points. We see provincial governments, basically shutting down businesses, shutting down schools. We see mask mandates and vaccine mandates go into effect. And while I would say the fact that, high 80s, 90% of Canadians are now vaccinated and have gone along with these measures, there's always been a sort of, vocal minority of people who are, dead set opposed to these vaccine mandates.
You mentioned a woman named Tamera Leach. Who is she and what's been her role in all of this?
Yeah, Tamera Leach she's been described as the leader of this current protest more than others. She's been certainly more front and center than almost anybody else.
These past 2 years, the COVID mandates have divided us. This protest began because of the federal government's restrictions on trucker freedoms. Our movement has grown in Canada and across the world because common people are tired of the mandates and restrictions in their own lives
describes herself as a Métis woman from Alberta, somebody who has ties to the oil and gas industry. She's been involved in, I think, Western separatist politics. She's been involved with what's been known as the Maverick Party, a sort of upstart political party which would like to secede from the rest of Canada.
And she's also the person, I believe, who started that GoFundMe fundraiser. Is that right?
Yes, there was two names attached to the initial GoFundMe. Tamera Leach and Benjamin Dichter came in at a later stage. Benjamin Dichter is an interesting figure in his own right. He was a downtown Toronto political candidate running for the Conservative Party in 2014 and 2015. He gave a speech in 2019 to Maxime Bernier's People's Party of Canada, where he denounced what he calls political Islam, which seems to have been, groups like the Muslim Brotherhood are trying to infiltrate Canada and Canadian political parties. It's not a view that I don't think is supported in much fact, but he actually stood up in front of the People's Party of Canada in 2019, describing political Islam as a threat to Canadian society at large, and even encouraged all political candidates in the coming election in 2019 to sign a form saying that they stood against this. So, and I found certain documents in a Toronto court saying that Benjamin Dichter is being sued for these, what some people would consider Islamophobic views, and for disparaging a Islamic charity. So now Dichter has recently sort of appeared on Fox News and talking about driving a truck.
COVID comes along, and now they're treated like insects by the bureaucracy.
Exactly, by insects. Wow. Benjamin Dichter,
I asked his defense lawyer in the lawsuit, does he actually own a truck? And what the lawyer did say that it's his understanding that Benjamin Dichter now does some work as a trucker as well, which was surprising.
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting background that you've managed to find there. So we have these two figures, Tamera Leach and Benjamin Dichter, who started this GoFundMe fundraiser. I just want to quickly ask, what happened with the millions of dollars that was raised there?
Well, yeah, that was, the initial $10 million fund that was raised from a multitude of sources, giving the truckers a huge war chest for supplies of food and fuel that could keep them in Ottawa indefinitely. GoFundMe was under enormous pressure to not relay those funds. And ultimately, GoFundMe chose not to do that. It returned the funds to donors. GoFundMe found that the protest had evolved from its original stated aims. GoFundMe found a violation of its terms of service, saying that it was crossing into the promotion of violence and harassment. And with that, this sort of poof, $10 million from GoFundMe disappears. But that's not the end of the story.
Yes, and we are going to get into the money angle for sure, because there's a lot of interesting things there. But I guess just to go back to the organization that's happening here. So a bunch of organizers, including Tamera, held a press conference on February 3rd. Who are the spokespeople who are involved here in representing the movement?
Yeah, well, Tamera is certainly one of them. Benjamin Dichter is certainly another one of them. There's folks like, Chris Barber, who is, I believe, a trucker from Saskatchewan, who is sort of emerged as a sort of third person in the triumvirate. And after that, it fans out into a whole bunch of other people and personalities.
Okay, yeah, that's. Thank you for laying that out, because it does help us understand this. I want to ask you about the press conference that was just this week. At that press conference, we heard a man say that they wanted to sit down with the opposition parties and the Governor General.
I'm willing to sit at a table with the Conservatives and the NDP and the Bloc as a coalition. I'll sit with the Governor General. You put us at the table with somebody that actually cares about Canada.
Who was that person who made that statement?
Yeah, so that was Tom Marazzo. He's he appears to be doing some computer science work these days, but I think he's a former Canadian Forces soldier, and he described himself as certainly somebody who, was using his past background in security writ large to be the interface between the protesters and Ottawa police and parliamentary precinct police and other groups. Now, he was not, inventing this concept. He said basically at a press conference, we will sit down with the Governor General, the Bloc Québécois, the Conservatives, But he also paid no recognition to the fact that there is a Liberal government in Canada in the House of Commons that was elected just this past fall. In fact, there was a manifesto produced in December by a group, I think, called Canada Unity. It is one of the many groups affiliated with this cause, but it was a very lengthy document spelling out how this coalition, these groups that are coming together in the name of the Freedom Convoy 2022, would like to enter into a pact with the Governor General of Canada and the Senate of Canada to sort of take control of essentially the entire country and, do away with all the pandemic measures that have been imposed at the federal and provincial level. Now, they put out an update, I think, just yesterday saying that the MOU does not reflect the spirit and the intent of the Freedom Convoy Movement 22.
Yeah.
Even though essentially...
So essentially they withdrew it. Isn't that right? Essentially they withdrew it this week.
Well, they said, squarely, we are immediately withdrawing the MOU as we do not want any unintended interpretations to continue. Though disavowed, now animated a lot of the trucker convoy language and rhetoric, and all this notion that the trucker convoy could themselves be a force of government by aligning with any combination of the opposition parties in the House of Commons or the Senate or the Governor General kind of is an end run around the fact that there is a duly elected Liberal minority government in power that has signaled that it's in no way going to submit to this protest and do away with the pandemic measures.
So Tom Morozzo, you mentioned, was also kind of liaising between the government and then the authorities, I guess, essentially. Are there other people here who are talking to the police on behalf of this movement and kind of, I guess, being a go-between between the authorities and this movement?
Yeah, there are a number of people who actually used to work in federal security agencies who are now claiming to be doing intelligence for the convoy or police liaison for the convoy. And Morazzo's one of them. Another figure is Corporal Daniel Bulford, who was, came to the public's attention last fall under the banner of MountiesForFreedom.com, in which he came forward as a Mountie who used to do personal protection for Prime Minister Trudeau, but is now no longer Mountie and is dead set against the vaccine mandate.
But I will not participate in this authoritarian type behavior. I refuse to. And I would encourage my law enforcement brothers and sisters out there, if vaccinated or not, doesn't matter, do not enforce unjust regulations and COVID measures. You know what I mean?
Another figure is Tom Quiggin, a former, intelligence analyst at the Privy Council office from, I think, the early 2000s. He is an intimate of Benjamin Dichter and also getting sued for allegedly defaming an Islamic charity. So, but Quiggin did have a role in a federal security agency, many years ago.
So like any big movement, there's a lot happening online, of course, as well, on social media. Who would you say is the most influential voice attached to the convoy who's speaking online?
Yeah, it's hard to gauge the overall influence of any of these folks, but Pat King is certainly right up there. I mean, he is this ubiquitous presence on social media in the context of the current trucker convoy protest. He's not been afforded leadership status per se, but he seems to be enormously influential to his constituency. So Pat King, announced himself as a sort of instrumental figure in the current trucker convoy protest. He's been, spending hours almost each day on social media. What the Canadian Anti-Hate Network has done is, highlight that King has posted about the Anglo-Saxon replacement theory, where immigrants and refugees will be taking over Canada from, essentially people of British descent.
It's called depopulation of the Caucasian race, or the Anglo-Saxon.
And he disavows, of course, ties to racism, or being a racist or conspiracy theorist for that matter.
And he does seem to at least be speaking directly to protesters from social media. Seems to, at least in some ways, talking directly to people. For example, when the injunction went down earlier this week about stopping horn honking in Ottawa, he posted a video telling truckers to stop.
I need everybody's attention. Spread this out far and wide to everybody out there. 100% need all truckers dead silent on the horns. Everybody, dead silent on the horns.
And I don't know, we can't really say how much of an influence that actually had, but he is speaking directly to people. So it sounds like a substantial part in this, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, you don't see Pat King's names on the memos, but, Pat King is a ubiquitous social media presence who many people might conflate to be a leader of the convoy protest.
Okay. And we're just looking. So he's got over 300,000 followers on Facebook. So
yeah.
substantial reach there.
Yeah. And of course, it all gets endlessly recycled onto other platforms. And, so he probably has the single most biggest social media presence of any of the figures.
Okay. Let's bring it back to the money, because we talked a little bit about the GoFundMe fundraiser initially. It's essentially been dissolved, I guess, now. But there's other fundraising that is in the works currently. What else is at play here, and who's been organizing this?
Last Friday evening, it was, GoFundMe pulled the plug, and the organizers, Tamera Leach, immediately was on social media urging people to use an alternative crowdfunding service known as Give, Send, Go. And, earlier, Give, Send, Go basically put out a press release, a statement saying, we would love to have GoFundMe's business. We are the fundraising site we are a Christian fundraising site, and we won't interfere with freedom. They've already raised millions, I think, as of the recording of this podcast, in the sort of, as of yesterday, $5 million range, I think, Canadian. There was another channel, which is Benjamin Dichter, who, has been sort of touting Bitcoin as the sort of chosen cryptocurrency or of the convoy protesters. And he's tapped into a whole other sort of constituency, which is the cryptocurrency constituency, who just think this is a great tool because it is by nature very hard for governments to intercept or block, and it's not controlled by any corporation that can be prevailed upon to do the same. So now we're seeing sort of a brisk cryptocurrency fundraising campaign.
And do we know if this money has actually gone to anyone? Like, are the protesters who are in Ottawa, have they actually seen any money to pay for gas and pay for food and stuff like that?
So GoFundMe raised $10 million, but $1 million of that was apparently released by GoFundMe to the Freedom Convoy organizers, who last week registered a registered not-for-profit entity, Freedom Convoy 2022, with some named controlling directors that will be dispersing these funds. Now, how fast they're being dispersed or what's being bought, I don't have any knowledge of that. I think it is either trying to set up the appropriate mechanisms to ensure that the money gets to the truckers, because the convoy organizers have repeatedly stated this is not for us, this organizer, that organizer, another organizer. It's going to go to the truckers, it's going to feed them, it's going to fuel them, etc. But
the cryptocurrency fundraising, is there any chance that money could be blocked, I guess, in a similar way that the GoFundMe money was blocked or prevented from getting to these individuals?
There's a lot of interest in cutting the funding or curbing the funding or prosecuting. Mark Carney wrote the former Bank of Canada governor wrote an essay for our newspaper saying that this, you have to use every legal mechanism to stop the flow of foreign funding. Well, it's not that simple. There are, certainly people who study the law that I've spoke to, people like Jessica Davis, a former FinTrack and CSIS analyst, and Leah West, who worked as a federal national security lawyer, are sort of hard-pressed to think of any laws that currently exist that could be used here to block the flow of funds. I think what they said is federal investigators are looking at this, but if the flow of funds is legal under our current laws, then not much anybody can do about it. Now, there was a memo put out about 6 months ago by the FinTrack, the Financial Intelligence Agency of Canada, saying that, they were overall concerned about people gravitating to sort of whack-a-mole crowdfunding services where you shut down one, but then another crowdfunding pops up, and the rise of cryptocurrency, which, are effectively not very easily traceable in the same way that more standard money flows would be. As much as the government might want to make noise about curbing the flow of funds, there aren't a lot of legal mechanisms to do so.
Mm-hmm. So, Colin, from everything we've talked about here, it sounds like there's people from a lot of different corners that have really come together in this movement. What would you say brings them all together? Like, what do they all have in common then?
Right. So, I've attended a couple of these sort of satellite rallies, like last Saturday when the protest in Toronto, and it was one of several across provincial capitals in Canada, and you would hear people like Lamont Degler from an anti-vaccination sort of group known as The Line say, we've been waiting for 2 years for the truckers to come here, or an issue like the truckers to come here, because what the truckers have supplied is a sort of a rallying point, a sort of palatable blue-collar work ethic protagonist figure that a lot of causes could glom themselves onto, even though they are not themselves truckers or in the trucking industry. We print every day that the mainstream trucker organizations disavow this protest, and truckers are 90% vaccinated like everybody else in Canada. There are entities like the Canadian Security Intelligence Service in Ottawa, a federal government agency, that has been issuing public warnings about ideologically motivated extremism. And what is that? It's something that's nebulous by nature, where you have these sort of people who are suspicious of government, who don't like Justin Trudeau, who may be angry. And this was always there, but what's been happening is that the COVID and the COVID pandemic measures have sort of accelerated these pre-existing trends, so that all of a sudden people who wouldn't have necessarily common cause with each other suddenly have a common cause together, and that is basically the authority of the state. I think there was, even the previous week in Vaughan, when the convoy rally was passing through that city north of Toronto, I spoke to a woman whose own husband died of COVID, but there she was joining the Freedom Convoy and saying that she'd had enough of pandemic measures, and, her dead husband would support her appearance in that protest. So again, whoever the organizers are, there are a lot of people they've brought along who've been frustrated with the pandemic and the government response to it for whatever reason. I think their exhaustion and frustration with this sort of perpetual state of society being on hold is something the government should register. At the same time, the ringleaders, everybody should know, bring to the table some problematic pre-existing views and are sort of, in the cases of somebody like Benjamin Dichter, for example, and seem to be sort of, invoking the truckers for reasons that are unrelated necessarily, or at least fitting it into a paradigm where they want to cause people to question the power and authority of the state.
And just lastly here, because you mentioned that you were speaking to protesters last weekend in Toronto. From everything that you've seen and that you've looked at, how are the protesters' views, how aligned are they with the views of the leadership of this movement?
I don't think they are necessarily aligned. I do think that there's a lot of people who see utility in advancing their own brands and causes around this rallying point, and a lot of people that were relegated to the margins individually have found each other. None of this is to say that people don't have a legitimate right of protest. None of this is to say that the pandemic hasn't been hard on the working class or put people out of work, because I think, there is a lot of people who have lost their jobs, who are having trouble feeding their families. That's all there. And there's a lot of people, frankly, who don't like the pandemic measures or don't want them to go on forever and would like to get their lives back to normal. But I think that is fuel for the, fire that's currently raging in Ottawa, where you sort of have a inner circle of people like whom we discussed, who had their own causes and who found each other and who found a rallying point to bring everybody together.
Colin, thank you so much for speaking with us and helping us understand everything that's going on here.
Thank you very much.
That's it for today. I'm Menaka Raman-Wilms. Our producers are Madeline White and Cheryl Sutherland. David Crosby edits the show. Kasia Mihailovich is our senior producer, and Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.